Welcome to this Energy Quick Chat, where we bring you expert insights on what's trending in the energy sector. Now, today we are exploring key findings from the State of the Global Mini Grids Market Report 2024, which was recently launched by the Mini Grids Partnership and led by the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All. The report outlines the progress, challenges, and future prospects in the mini grids market. Now, to help us break down this report, we have with us William Brent, the Chief Marketing Officer of Husk Power Systems, a company at the forefront of providing clean energy solutions through renewable energy, mini grid, and microgrids. William, welcome to this interview chat.
Great to be here, Justina. Thanks.
Now, that report came out recently, just a few days ago. What were your key takeouts from the latest Global Mini Grids report?
Generally, I would say that my main takeaway was that the industry is on the right track, but that we're still quite a distance from the type of scale that we need to achieve the full potential of the industry. Just to give you a sense of what that means, in Sub-Saharan Africa alone, the World Bank says that mini grids are the least cost method for connecting 380 million people. And that would require 160,000 mini grids. So quite a significant scale in terms of what the potential is. And you would have seen from the report that globally, at the end of 2021, there are only about 80,000 connections. So 80,000 compared to 380 million is a huge distance. And if you assume that of that 80,000 that were connections that we now have, let's say half of those are in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is probably an optimistic number, we would still need to grow the number of connections at least 3x, 3 times annually between now and the end of the decade to get to that 380 million number. So, there's a huge gap still in terms of scale that still needs to be overcome. So, again, we're making progress, investments increasing, number of connections is increasing. But even on the investment side, I think last year the report said about $2 billion was invested in the sector. We need tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, or to get to the scale that we're talking about. So, we're on the right track, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Right. Like you said, the huge gap in that space in terms of scaling. And I think while listening to that webinar, one thing was prevalent, which is how to scale, how to de-risk investments. Now, I wanted to ask, what are the most effective strategies for de-risking mini grid investments?
I think a couple things come to mind for me. Number one, I think the industry itself has to have a mutually agreed upon set of metrics that we're trying to hit. And so what are those things that we're trying to measure? Levelized cost of energy, capacity utilization. These are things that still, I would say, are not uniformly agreed upon within the industry. In order for investors to look at what we do as an asset category, we need to have uniformity in terms of how we're measuring our own performance. So I think that's one thing. I think, obviously the other is just the investment community and the funding community needs to see more successes, right? We still don't have a critical mass of companies that are achieving profitability and scale. And, as any investor would tell you, they're looking for a proven industry that has, positive stories to tell around specific countries. And I think we're still missing, a critical mass of those companies. So, I think, and that requires us to, as an industry, to come together and agree on sort of how we're measuring ourselves. I think there's a lot of other work that needs to be done as well on the investor side and the funder side. I think in particular, the development finance institutions, people refer to them as the DFIs, their mandate when they were first founded was to help de-risk nascent industries in developing markets and make sure that those technologies and solutions could get to scale. I think the DFI community needs to do a lot more to put up more risk capital, especially when it comes to equity, corporate equity for companies in this industry. Right now, there's a real valley of death between the early stage companies and the growth stage companies, where equity is almost non-existent. And the only way that that's going to change is if funders like the DFIs take their mandate for de-risking solutions seriously, and instead of thinking that I'm going to make commercial returns on these investments, I'm going to make lower than commercial returns, or maybe even lose money, because it's part of the mandate and the philosophy behind how the DFIs were founded. So, there are many other things, specific things that you could do to help de-risk the market, in terms of first loss guarantees. Currency devaluation is a real issue in many markets. How do you overcome that so that the stress of currency devaluation it isn't felt so strongly by companies like ours? So we could get into many details, but I'd say those are some of the things that come to mind immediately.
Now, you've mentioned very key strategies. The need for uniformity in performance, need for more successes, DFI's involvement, and the need for them to do more. Now, how can blended finance be optimized to attract private capital and enable mini-grid deployment in the Sub-Saharan African region?
Yeah, so, as an industry, we're looking for equity, debt, and grant funding, right? So when you talk about blended finance, those are the three types of financing that would be included in that. I think there's still the grant funding piece is critical, because it will allow more commercial investors to come into the space if they've been de-risked through that grant capital. So I think there's the level of grant support currently is still quite low in most countries. And so there needs to be a greater proportion of grant funding available, especially because, as you may know, the World Bank and the African Development Bank have announced a Mission 300 initiative to connect 300 million people by the end of the decade. That's a huge objective. And it won't happen unless those three types of financing are available. So grant funding, for sure, there's a huge gap in terms of grant funding that will bring in more commercial type investors into the industry. On the debt side, because there's so much devaluation in countries like Nigeria, but others as well, really being able to access local debt, debt in local currency is still something that we haven't seen done at scale, and that has to change in order to be able to overcome that currency risk. And then, as I mentioned, on the equity side, it's fairly easy for companies to find the funding at the early stage to build the projects that they need to build. It's also fairly easy, I wouldn't say easy, but you can access financing at a growth stage as well. Husk is a growth stage company. We raised $100 million last October. So, there is that capital available, but it's not easy to obtain. It still takes far too long. But in the middle, between the early stage and the growth stage, as I mentioned, there's this, valley of death, right, that companies need to be able to get over in order to get to the growth stage. And that equity in that category of investment is almost impossible to find. And that's stymieing a lot of growth potential for companies in this space. So I think, you have to apply the levers of all three at the same time. And right now we're still not seeing the types of capital at the quantum needed to sort of achieve the targets that have been set.
And Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the World Bank and the African Development Bank. Now, aside these two financial institutions, what programs and initiatives are currently and effectively being used to finance local mini-grid developers across the continent?
So I think you'd have to look at the countries where the most scale has been achieved. So Nigeria, for sure, is, I would say, leading in those in terms of those countries. So the federal government in Nigeria, the Rural Electrification Agency there, I think they've been pioneers in terms of helping the mini grid industry scale in that country. The NEP program that existed and now will be replaced by a new program called DARES. I think, it's $750 million. That's a significant chunk of capital. And the Nigerian government deserves a lot of credit for that. Madagascar is another country, I think, where you've seen scale achieved, largely due to similar types of programs there. And other countries appear to be moving in that direction. There's discussion around the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and others. And then there are also some results-based financing programs that are focused on the African region. But again, there's too many of them, I would say. Instead of having 4 or 5 of them, there really ought to be just one Pan-African RBF. Results-based financing, that's sort of a single point of financing. And also that needs to be significantly increased in terms of the scale, right? Instead of just millions of dollars for an RBF, we really we're at a point now where we need enough capital to deploy tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So, I think the RBF programs, while helpful, are still not sort of getting to the scale needed to address the opportunity, but also the challenge. So I think, but I think by far and away, Nigeria stands out for me, and the program there that the government is put in place as a leading example for what can be done.
Right. Now, as we wrap up, you at Husk Power Systems, you guys have done a lot in this space and, expanding in Africa, especially in Nigeria. Now, what is your outlook for the mini-grid market in the coming years? And what else is Husk Power doing in this regard to fill this gap?
I mean, right now, we're just trying to scale, right? So in India, which was the first country that we started, we are building 20 mini-grids on average per month, right? In Nigeria, we're averaging about 6 per month. We need to get to a monthly scale where, we have the same capacity in Nigeria as we do in India. And then we need to do that in, half a dozen other countries, right? So Husk Power is looking to other countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also has a huge unelectrified population and looking to expand into that market. I think that, there's probably going to be some level of consolidation that's needed as well in the industry in the coming years so that we can achieve the scale that's needed. I think there's typically a sort of general understanding that an industry, 80% of a market, whatever that market is, typically owned by 3 companies, right? So if you think of that as sort of the end goal or the end outcome of the mini grid industry, where there's 3 companies that account for 80% of the market, there has to be some consolidation that's coming that allows for economies of scale. But I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. What is the role of the mini grid industry in this new Mission 300 project that the World Bank and African Development Bank has announced? What are the resources and tools that will be deployed to help us to get to that number? I think, governments as well, many more are putting in place regulatory frameworks and that are conducive to growing the mini grid industry. But I'd say even more important than the regulatory side is the political will that needs to be there that makes sure that those regulations are actually adhered to and implemented over time. the lifetime of the mini grid. So we build assets that are 20 to 25 years, right? So that political will needs to be there as well over the lifetime of the projects that we're building. And I think that that's going to have to require a lot more work and education from all of us, the World Bank, African Development Bank, the industry itself, others, to make sure that that political will is there and that it's consistent over time and sustainable.
Now, while you were rounding up, you raised certain questions, and one that just stuck in my mind was the role of mini grid in the Mission 300 framework of the World Bank and the AFDB. And hopefully we would get answers to that as the time goes by. Thank you so much, William, for sharing your insights on the state of the Global Mini Grids Market Report 2024. I appreciate your time and expertise on this topic.
Thank you, Justina. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for watching. Bye for now.